So I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me, and I'd also like to apologise that I'm speaking in English. Unfortunately, my Italian is so bad that I can only just about order a cappuccino. However, I do remember never to do it after 9 o'clock in the morning. Who says us English can't be Europeans? Right, so what I'm going to try to do today is talk about climate change and migration. But to do that, we need to actually look at the fundamental drivers of the economy. So the first thing is that in 12 years' time, the amount of energy we'll require in the world will increase by 50%. The amount of food we'll need will increase by 50%, and water will increase by 30% to feed that energy and food demand. On top of that, we have to consider development and population growth. And the key thing is, right in the middle of that, is the threat and the spectre of climate change. And this all leads to what we call the perfect storm. We have to solve problems in the 21st century that we hadn't ever considered. So if I start off with climate change. Climate change is just simple physics. Sun's energy passes through the atmosphere as if it's not there. And if you happen to be lying on a beautiful Italian beach and the sun is falling on you, it is mainly light, it hits your skin, it converts to heat, and you feel hot. It's exactly what happens to the Earth. Now, of course, 30% of that sunlight bounces back into space off of white clouds and white ice, but 2/3 is absorbed by the land and sea and radiated out back into space. However, the greenhouse gases absorb some of that heat and hold it briefly before releasing it back into space, which is good. If we took out all the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, we would drop the temperature of the world by 35 degrees. So that would mean an average Italian summer would be about -5, and a winter would be about -35. So greenhouse gases tick, they're good. Except, due to industrialization, due to deforestation, we've been increasing the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases all the way through the industrial period, and we've already broken 400 parts per million. Now, this is from observations in Mauna Loa. We have observations now all the way around the world, but it doesn't really put it into context. So this is the variations of carbon dioxide and methane over the last million years. And as you can see, these are the beautiful ice ages that we have, and then we have some warm periods. And if we look through here, these actual gas measurements are from ice cores, so from bubbles trapped in ice in Antarctica and Greenland, which have been liberated and then measured. And what we've done in the last 100 years is we've increased CO2 by 48%. We've doubled the amount of methane in the atmosphere. So what we've done is started to increase that greenhouse effect, causing warming. And we have the weight of evidence. Science is about reproduction and the weight of the evidence put together. And as you can see here, from the 1860s all the way through to the 1940s and then through up until the present day, there's been a steady warming due to those increased greenhouse gases. 2016 is the warmest year on record, and I'd say there's about a 50-50 chance that actually 2018 might just beat 2016. The strangest thing is that my eldest daughter is 19. She has lived through 18 of the warmest years on record. She is truly a child of the global warming era. And I'll just show this in a different way because, again, different approaches. This is the same climate data done monthly, slowly going through time. And it just gives you a different visual reconstruction of how this climate has been changing. Now, there are two levels on there, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, because those are the ones that we're going to talk about as limits. For those of you who like maps, because I'm a geographer by heart and training, this is a map. This is how much the world has warmed from 1901 to 2012. The white squares, of course, are where we don't have enough data from the past. But as you can see, there is strong warming all across the globe. But as good scientists, you should never trust one data set. You should have a look at all the data sets put together. So in the top left, that's Northern Hemisphere snow cover, which actually is bad news for my passion of skiing, because of course it's been reducing every single year. Top right is the amount of heat which is being absorbed and stored by the ocean. Bottom left, summer sea ice extent. Reporters love going up to the Arctic every summer and going, look, the ice is melting. Well, yes, the ice melts every summer in the Arctic. However, the extent of it is getting smaller and smaller. And here, on the bottom right, is, of course, sea level change and the accelerated sea level change that we've had over the last century. So scientists have been mandated from about 1990 to try and actually predict the future. Now, of course, that's very difficult. So the way they do it is they build complex computer models which are based on the fundamentals of physics. So the equations of physics, and they build maps of networks around the world with different layers. And as you can see, from 1990 to 2013, the power of computers has so increased, as so has the actual level of detail. The interesting thing is 1990, the UK was definitely stuck as part of Europe, but of course by 2013, we're now a separate island, okay? I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing. So the models have to take in scenarios, because we have one major problem. The science is really straightforward. The physics is straightforward. The biggest problem is you lot, okay? We have no idea how many people are going to be in the world by the end of the century. How much carbon are you going to emit? What sort of lifestyle will you have? And so what happens is the social scientists, economists, and scientists together put together scenarios, stories of what the future could be. So these are the two different scenarios. So this is the business as usual, or as I call it, the Donald Trump world. My favorite person. And as you can see, this one is highly political. This is the 2 degrees. So basically, at Paris and at Copenhagen before that, the only thing that the politicians really agreed on, well, we should save the planet and keep it from warming above 2 degrees. They then told the scientists, could you please make up scenarios of how to get to that place? And so even though the models can show it, later on I'm going to show you how extreme that really is for our change in global economy. So what are the effects of climate change? Because, again, how are we going to bring this back to migration? So the first thing is, because you're putting more energy in the system, you get more extreme storms, floods, droughts, and heat waves. Just look at the news and you can see all of these events in 2018. It may lead to food and water insecurity. One of the most important things in the world is the lack of food and water for half the population of the world. And then I put another thing, which is may, very strong word, may lead to migration and conflict. So, let's have a look at the climate change impact hotspots. So these basically are areas where food production, environmental migration, sea level rise, and degradation of the water system are already starting to happen. And as you can see, it is, of course, in the sort of like Central America, in South America, Southern Africa, south of the Sahara, north of the Sahara, and in Southeast Asia. Places that you would know in your instinct are places that are very vulnerable. But I give you a case study of how extreme changes could occur in the recent future. So this is Bangladesh. Okay? It's a delta country. It basically has land which is all below 5 meters, and it has a population of about 190 million. So it has the same land area as the United Kingdom, but twice the population. And let's just predict. So this is the Bangladesh Center of Advanced Study who did this work. So it's not Western scientists telling poor people what's going to happen to them. This is their own scientists looking at their country. So let's look at a 1 meter rise in sea level. That isn't actually that extreme because it takes in half a meter due to sea level rise due to global warming, but also half a meter of dropping because, of course, the actual sediment has basically been blocked off around the major rivers because, of course, India has put in hydroelectric power dams to have electricity with a low carbon footprint. You can start to see some of the irony creeping in here. So, and there's also 10,000 tube wells drilled here to extract fresh drinking water for the population. So this is the effect. That's 22% of the country which will be underwater by the end of this century. And the interesting thing is that the politics as such is that the Indians are already building a double razor wire fence all the way around Bangladesh because they're worried about environment migrants. So there's a new report that came out last Monday whereby the IPCC, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, looked at the possibilities of keeping the world to 1.5 degrees warming. Remember, we're already at 1 degree. And what they did was they looked at all the risks that would change from, say, where we are now, which is the grey band here, up to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. The more purple it is, the worse it is. And I'm just going to select bits here. Coastal flooding, such as Bangladesh, river flooding, and crop yields are all things which are going to threaten human populations in the future. But climate change is not the main driver of migration now. You have to look at the fact that social drivers, political drivers, economic drivers, and demographic drivers are still the predominant drivers of change. There are environmental factors as well, and I'm going to talk about 2 possible case studies. And actually, these all together as a nexus leads to a decision-making system whereby you think about the political and the obstacles to decide whether you want to migrate or you want to stay. There's population pressures. This is a map distinguished by the different sizes of the countries in terms of population. And we also know that by the middle of this century, there will be another 2.5 billion people. I'll just let that settle in. There'll be 10 billion people by 2050. Now, the interesting thing is that this is probably going to stabilize and may even shrink. So the population isn't going to run away, but we have to plan for a world of 10 billion people. The big problem that we have, of course, is family planning within the UN system, because, of course, the gag laws that were put in by Bush and now Trump cause problems due to the lack of funding for this area. Poverty is a key driver of migration. Now, if we have a look, this is in billions of people. So we look from 1981 to 2010, the number of people who have who live on $1.25 a day has gone down from nearly 2 billion to basically 1.2 billion. That's still 1.2 billion people, 1 in 7 people that live on about $1 a day. And the really interesting thing is if you take out China from that, so this is the purple, you take out China from that, nothing's really changed in the world. So the Great Chinese Experiment has actually, over the last 30 years, lifted most of their population out of extreme poverty. But it hasn't happened elsewhere. So when you see those global stats, remember that they're actually aggregating success stories with failure. So politicians now use the term climate refugees. Ban Ki-moon used this when he was the UN Secretary General about the Darfur conflict. He said, as an ecological crisis arising partly from climate change. The media also uses the term climate refugees, and I love the talk earlier that said, actually, we should be telling more complicated stories. There is not a simple climate change causes migration, causes conflict. And the key thing is there is little or no evidence in the academic literature or in the data to say that there is any link between climate change and conflict or climate change and forced migration. So one of the studies I've done is East Africa, an area that I spend a lot of time working in and love dearly. And it has a long history of conflict and human displacement. The UN Refugee Agency reports that there are now 20 million displaced people in Africa. The World Bank, earlier this year, in a wonderful storm of publicity, said, oh, because of climate change, that will go up to 86 million. Now, I'm going to dispute that. The reason being is because if you look at conflict in East Africa since 1963, you'll see that there is a huge peak and then a drop. And this peak centers around the early to late 1990s. You can look at it in terms of other drivers. So this is a measure of how stable or unstable the actual area was. And each country has been part of this calculation. And you notice that it's not until we get to about 2010 that we have an average stable governance structures in these countries. And then if we look at the economy, that line is where the economy is growing. So during the 80s and 90s, there was negative economic growth in East Africa, while there was large population growth. If we then look at the total number of displaced people, strong peak again here in the late 1990s, and you can see also refugees. So again, interesting difference. Displaced people are people that are forced to move within a country or beyond countries. Refugees are those who are forced to cross borders or have chosen to cross borders. When we looked at the drought, and this is the climate change influence on East Africa, you can see warm, so wet and dry events, and you can see the classic Ethiopian drought here, the droughts of the 1990s. There is a small correlation with displacement of people. The interesting thing is actually the key correlation is with refugees. So climate variations played little or no part in the causation of conflict or displacement of people in East Africa over the last 50 years, even though we know climate change has occurred. Rapid population growth, low or negative economic growth, and political instability seem to be the major controls. Severe droughts did contribute to refugees, i.e. pushing people across international borders. Well, let's look at the other one, the poster child of the climate change migration nexus, the Syrian case. Population 22 million, hot dry summers, mild wet winters, middle income developing country. Interestingly enough, had 11% of people below the poverty lane, which is about the same as the USA. Not sure what that says about either country. 10% of the population in 2007 were already refugees from Iraq, Palestine, and Lebanon. And it had a repressive government with some corruption. From 2006 to 2007, if you have a look at these diagrams, actually bad seasons started to really crop up. And this one, the 2007-2008 season, was incredibly bad. 60% of the land was affected by drought. Sandstorms were happening every 2 weeks. 1.3 million farmers lost 75% of their crop in 2007 and migrated to the cities. But the fundamental question is, did this cause mass migration and the Civil War? Now, the interesting thing is, had the government decided to actually provide support for those 1.3 million farmers, or provided actual income or food to allow them to stay on their land through that period of drought, then they wouldn't have moved in. And also, remember, Lebanon, Egypt, and many other countries that went through the same drought did not suddenly decide to have a civil war and basically have mass migration. So governance is the key issue. I love Sen's comment. No famine has ever taken place in history of the world in a functioning democracy. Conflict and migration are primarily caused by politics and poverty. But climate change is and will be a threat multiplier, not a cause. I just thought I'd support some of the previous speakers about developing countries and how we host only 14% of migrants. And this is to dispel the refugee myth, and these are the countries that actually currently hold most of the world's refugees. So, can we limit climate change for human well-being? Is there a plan? Can we save ourselves in the 21st century? So this is a really interesting report. This is the 1.5 degrees global warming report, which came out of Paris. So Paris, we're all happy about, yes, we've agreed we're going to try and save the world and keep it to 2 degrees. The developing countries got together and went, hang on, that still means that there's going to be huge amounts of changes in our countries. Our countries are still going to be flooded and taken over by sea level rise. Why not be more ambitious? So there was a little subtext that the French wonderfully put in. And I have to say the Paris Agreement was a beautiful piece of French diplomacy. How they negotiated and bullied everybody into that agreement is a beautiful story. But they also then slipped in there, but perhaps we could try 1.5 degrees, which then allowed the scientists to actually say, we'll show you how. So I've put the 0 degree line here. If we want to stick to 1.5 degrees, we need, by 2050, to have reduced our global carbon emissions to 0. Yeah, it's increasing by about 1 to 2% at this moment in time. So that's about a 5% decrease per year. They also pointed out that actually how fast you reduce the actual amount of emissions also will show you whether you need to include untested geoengineering to suck out CO2. So of course, if you do P1, that's beautiful. We all work together, we all love each other, we suddenly reduce emissions, and a bit of reforestation, rewilding, and looking after agriculture properly, we get to 1.5 degrees. Perfect. However, if we dally and we take a long time, say over here, we need this yellow here, we need to suck out a huge amount of CO2 from the atmosphere with stuff of technology which haven't yet invented to try and actually save the planet. The other interesting thing about this report, it is one of the first that actually acknowledges that climate change is one of the 4 major issues of the 21st century. Poverty alleviation, sustainability, security, and climate change need to be solved together. So the report actually puts the changes needed within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've just put it up here, the Stockholm Resilience Centre view of how the biosphere, society, and the economy fit in with the 17 Sustainability Development Goals. But hang on. Maybe this is because we lack the money to save the planet and look after 10 billion people by the middle of the century. So what I've plotted up here is GDP growth from the 1600s onwards. As you notice, yeah, we're here. The world economy will double in the next 25 years. That will be larger than all the doublings that have gone before. That's scary on many levels. One, just think of the environmental damage you can do with twice the amount of money in the world. Just to put it in context, Italy's GDP in 2018 will be $2.4 trillion. So I ask you, why do we still have poor people? And I put up one last slide, because climate change is always seen as it's a capitalist problem, we're having to solve it through capitalism, etc. But if we're looking at money, at the moment, the richest 1% of adults took in 82% of the wealth created in 2017. The bottom half of the world, 3.6 billion, own less than 1%. And I love this from Oxfam. So Oxfam basically said, right, how many of the richest billionaires do you need to have in a room to be equal to 3.5 billion people? So it wasn't too bad. So, okay, so 2010, 2011, you'd have to basically have this auditorium. So just imagine you're all billionaires, you're the richest billionaires. You own the same as 3.5 billion people. Okay? And then it slowly, unfortunately, gets worse. Down to 62 people in 2015. And the last calculation is 42 people in 2017 have the same wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. And you wonder why we can't fix climate change. It's not lack of money. So, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd like to point out this is a brilliant cartoon by Joel Pett from US Today before the Copenhagen meeting, and I'd point out that, of course, we could have energy independence, we could preserve the rainforests, we have sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean water, clean air, healthy children, a better, safer world. But guess what? Maybe it's all a hoax by us scientists just making it up to make you have a better world. Thank you very much.